So in these videos, I'm going to give you a quick overview of some of the key features of the different bits of the Cold War. So here we're going to talk about the Potsdam Conference. So I'm going to do three things in each of the videos, and hopefully they'll be quite quick, and these are, just remember, a quick summary of them. So I'm going to talk about the story of the event, I'm going to talk about the consequences of that event, and then the importance in the development of the Cold War. So in terms of the story of Potsdam, remember Potsdam is the last of the peace conferences. So at Potsdam, the Allies met after the surrender of Germany, so they can finally finalise the principles of the post-war peace. So Potsdam is effectively like the Versailles of World War II. Now, unlike at Yalta, the relationship between the superpowers had worsened quite considerably. So in March 1945, Stalin had invited communist Polish leaders to meet him and arrested them. Things had got so bad, actually, that the British Joint Planning Group had started to meet to potentially think about plans for a total war if they were going to go to war with Russia. So you've got to remember that this conference, the relationship is very strained in comparison to the other conferences. One of those big reasons is that Roosevelt has died by this point, so Truman has taken over, and he's much more inclined to have a tough line with Russia. You've got to remember at this point he has used the atomic bomb, he's in a much stronger position in terms of the war with Japan, and he doesn't need Russia like they'd needed Russia previously. However, they do come to some agreements. So at the conference it was agreed that the 4 zones of occupation in Germany, so Germany is going to be split into 4, Berlin also is going to be split into 4. The Nazi Party and the government and laws were to be destroyed. All German education is going to be controlled to try and eliminate any Nazi ideas, and they're going to try and have this kind of successful development of democratic ideas. Now, President Truman presents it as a compromise, but in reality, the Allies actually disagreed openly about lots of things, and this is going to act as a catalyst for the start of the Cold War. So they argued on the details of how to divide Germany. They argued about the reparations that Germany ought to pay. Remember, Russia is going to try and destroy Germany. The Allies have learned those lessons from Versailles, and they also argue significantly over Russia's influence over Eastern Europe. So that's the story of Potsdam. Now let's think about the consequences. What are the consequences of Potsdam? So firstly, Germany is divided into 4 zones, and Berlin, again, is divided into 4 sectors. Each zone is going to be occupied by one of the 4 allies, so either Britain, France, America, and Russia. And supposedly decisions on Germany would be taken jointly, but obviously that doesn't happen in reality. Now, the division of Germany, the reason this is important as a consequence is that this creates huge tensions between the 2 rivals over what to do with Germany. Obviously, we know that they have very differing views. We've got the capitalist Americans, we've got the communist Russians, and this tension that is created by this division of Germany is a constant kind of thread throughout the Cold War. So we see this in the Berlin airlift, we see this in the building of the Berlin Wall. Symbolically, when obviously the Berlin Wall falls at the end of the Cold War, obviously that shows how symbolic this kind of division of Germany is, setting up this kind of east-west divide. Second consequence is that Truman objects to the Soviet control of the countries of Eastern Europe and the arrangement for Poland agreed at Yalta. In theory, there are going to be free elections in Poland, but the reality is that when the elections did take place in 1947, they were far from free. And obviously what happens is that Stalin's expansion into Eastern Europe ensures that the Americans need to respond to this, and this is why we end up with the Truman Doctrine, etc. Now, we've touched on that briefly in the last slide in terms of the importance of Potsdam in the development of the Cold War. We're going to go into a little bit more detail. So we know that Stalin had no intention of allowing free elections. He sees Eastern Europe as a good buffer zone. So it further increased tensions between the sides. The creation of these satellite states in Eastern Europe, the countries that the Soviets freed from occupation and then actually just took over themselves, becomes really significant. So Stalin's reluctant to give control of these countries as he sees it as a buffer zone between the Soviet Union and Germany. Truman sees this as evidence that the Soviet Union wanted to spread communism worldwide. And we know that obviously the Americans detest communism and don't want it spreading. Secondly, in terms of importance then, is that on the 12th of March 1947, Truman delivered his speech to Congress, what comes known as the Truman Doctrine, and he announces in that speech how evil communism is, and he says he intends to stop it from spreading throughout the world, and especially in the countries of Europe. Remember, these countries in Europe have been torn apart by war and are very vulnerable. This speech becomes known as the Truman Doctrine, as I've just said, and effectively it signals the start of the containment policy and effectively the start of the Cold War. So those are the reasons that Potsdam's significant. Obviously, we've looked at the story, the consequences, and the importance.